He thought humiliating her in front of the entire Whitmore family would make him look powerful, but Richard Whitmore had no idea the quiet woman standing beneath the chandelier was about to inherit everything his family had spent generations trying to control. Rain slid slowly down the massive glass windows of the Whitmore estate as black luxury sedans lined the circular driveway one after another, their headlights cutting through the cold Connecticut evening like knives through fog. Men in tailored suits stepped onto the marble entrance with practiced confidence, while women wrapped in expensive cashmere whispered to one another beneath the golden glow of the mansion lights. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected across polished floors worth more than most people's homes, and every corner of the estate carried the smell of old money, aged bourbon, and silent competition. Charles Whitmore had been dead for exactly 6 days, and his family had gathered for one reason alone: the inheritance. Near the staircase, Richard Whitmore adjusted the cuff of his navy suit while speaking quietly to his younger cousin. "Dad built an empire," he said with a faint smile. "There's no way he'd leave control to anyone outside this family." His cousin nodded immediately. Everyone already believed Richard would become the new head of Whitmore Holdings. He certainly acted like it. At 53 years old, Richard carried himself with the cold certainty of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. The guests laughed a little louder when he spoke. The staff moved quicker when he entered a room. Even grief itself seemed forced to make room for his ego. Then the front door opened again. The room barely noticed at first. A woman stepped quietly into the estate holding a worn brown umbrella dripping rainwater onto the marble floor. She looked completely out of place among the diamonds and designer gowns surrounding her. Her long gray coat looked years old, and her simple leather shoes carried traces of rain from the driveway. She was in her late 60s, her silver hair tied neatly behind her head, her expression calm and unreadable. Margaret Hale paused near the entrance as if giving the room time to decide whether it wanted her there. It did not. Several conversations lowered into whispers almost immediately. One woman near the fireplace leaned closer to another and murmured, "Who invited her?" Another guessed she must have been one of Charles Whitmore's former housekeepers. Someone else quietly laughed. Margaret heard every word, but she showed no reaction. Her eyes moved slowly across the room, steady and observant, before resting briefly on the portrait of Charles hanging above the fireplace. For the first time that evening, her expression softened. A young valet approached awkwardly. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the service entrance is around back." A few people nearby smirked instantly. Margaret looked at the young man without embarrassment. "I'm here for the reading of the will," she replied softly. The valet froze. Before he could answer, Richard Whitmore stepped forward with a smile sharp enough to cut glass. "No," he said casually, loud enough for half the room to hear. "Let her stay. Tonight's already depressing enough. Maybe we could all use a little entertainment." A ripple of laughter spread through the hall. Margaret remained still. Richard slowly walked closer, studying her coat with obvious amusement. "Margaret Hale," he said, pretending surprise. "Wow, I almost didn't recognize you without a cleaning cart beside you." More laughter. One woman actually covered her mouth, trying not to grin. Richard continued, enjoying every second of the attention. "You know," he added, lifting a glass of bourbon, "my father did have a soft spot for strays." The room erupted again, but Margaret simply removed her gloves one finger at a time and folded them neatly in her hands. Her silence unsettled a few people immediately. Others mistook it for weakness. The massive grandfather clock near the staircase ticked loudly through the room as the laughter slowly faded into uncomfortable quiet. Richard tilted his head slightly. "So tell me," he asked, "did you come here hoping he left you his old gardening tools?" Another round of chuckles echoed beneath the chandeliers. Margaret finally looked directly at him. Her voice was calm. "No," she said. "I came because Charles asked me to be here." Something about the way she said his first name caused a subtle shift in the room. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. Richard noticed it too. His smile tightened for half a second before returning. "That's adorable," he replied. "Well, feel free to sit anywhere. Preferably somewhere washable." A hush fell again. Margaret nodded once and walked deeper into the estate without another word. Her shoes echoed softly against the marble floors while dozens of eyes followed her across the room. Some looked amused, others curious. But near the far end of the hall, attorney Daniel Mercer watched her differently. Unlike everyone else, he did not laugh. Because 6 days earlier, moments before Charles Whitmore died, the old billionaire had grabbed Daniel's wrist weakly and whispered one final instruction. When Margaret arrives, Charles had said quietly, "Watch the room carefully." And standing there beneath the golden chandelier, while the Whitmore family mocked the quiet woman in the gray coat, Daniel Mercer suddenly understood why. Margaret Hale chose a seat near the far end of the marble hall, away from the fireplace and far from the cluster of Whitmore relatives who circled one another like investors waiting for a market opening bell. She placed her folded gloves carefully on her lap and sat with perfect posture while crystal light shimmered across the polished floor beneath her shoes. Around her, low whispers continued moving through the room like cold wind. Richard Whitmore watched her from beside the bar with growing amusement, convinced her silence meant embarrassment. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who either feared him or needed something from him. And because of that, he no longer understood the difference between confidence and cruelty. A server carrying champagne passed near Margaret. Before she could politely refuse, Richard raised his glass toward the room. "Careful around her," he announced loudly. "I think she still believes this place belongs to working people." Several guests laughed again, though not quite as comfortably as before. Margaret did not react. She simply looked toward the rain rolling against the tall estate windows as if the voices around her belonged to another world entirely. The quiet, unsettled people more than anger would have. One of Richard's cousins leaned closer and whispered, "Why is she acting like she owns the place?" Richard smirked. "Because people like her survive on sympathy," he replied. "Give them attention and they mistake it for importance." Near the staircase, Daniel Mercer quietly organized several folders atop a long mahogany table prepared for the reading of the will. Every few seconds, his eyes drifted back toward Margaret. He remembered seeing her name handwritten twice inside Charles Whitmore's private documents during the final weeks before his death. That alone had been strange enough. Charles trusted almost no one. Yet somehow this quiet woman had remained close to him for decades without appearing in society pages, corporate events, or family photographs. It was as though she existed outside the world the Whitmores cared about. Richard suddenly crossed the room again, unable to resist one more performance. He stopped directly beside Margaret's chair and looked down at her with practiced superiority. "You know," he said, swirling the bourbon in his glass, "my father never learned how to say no to people with sad stories." The room quieted slightly. Margaret lifted her eyes calmly. Richard continued before she could speak. "Still, showing up here tonight takes confidence. Most people would be too ashamed." A few nervous laughs echoed nearby. Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Your father was kinder than you realize," she answered softly. Richard smiled thinly. "That is what weak people always say about rich men after they die." Margaret's eyes did not move. "No," she replied. "That is what honest people say when they remember who helped them before they became powerful." The words landed harder than anyone expected. Richard's smile faded for a fraction of a second. Behind him, two relatives exchanged uncertain glances. Even the server holding the champagne tray paused awkwardly. But Richard recovered quickly, forcing another laugh. "Well," he said loudly, turning back toward the room, "if she starts giving life lessons next, somebody please stop me from falling asleep." This time the laughter sounded thinner, less certain. Margaret lowered her gaze again, without another word. The giant grandfather clock struck 7 across the mansion, each deep metallic chime echoing beneath the chandeliers. Conversations slowly faded. Chairs shifted against marble floors. Daniel Mercer stepped toward the center table, holding the sealed documents in both hands. The estate seemed to grow colder all at once. Richard adjusted his suit confidently and took his seat at the head of the family section, still believing the night belonged to him. But as Daniel looked once more toward Margaret Hale, sitting quietly at the edge of the room, he realized something terrifying. She was the only person there who did not appear nervous about what the will might say. Daniel Mercer adjusted his glasses slowly as the final conversations faded beneath the chandeliers. The attorney had spent more than 30 years handling estates for wealthy families across New England, and over time, he had learned something important about money. The larger the fortune, the uglier the room became once inheritance entered the conversation. Tonight was proving him right. The Whitmore family sat around the long mahogany table with carefully controlled expressions, but Daniel could see the greed hiding underneath every polished smile. One woman quietly calculated property values on her phone beneath the table. A younger nephew stared impatiently at the grandfather clock as if every passing second delayed access to his future. Richard Whitmore sat at the center with complete confidence, leaning back in his chair while one arm rested across imported Italian leather. He looked less like a grieving son and more like a man waiting to receive applause. Only Margaret Hale seemed untouched by the tension filling the room. She sat near the edge of the hall beneath a dim wall sconce, hands folded gently in her lap, her attention fixed not on the documents but on the portrait of Charles Whitmore hanging above the fireplace. Rain continued tapping softly against the tall windows behind her, while lightning flashed far across the distant hills surrounding the estate. Daniel opened the first folder carefully. "Thank you all for attending," he said in a measured voice. "As requested by Charles Whitmore, the reading of the estate will proceed tonight in full." The room fell silent except for the crackling fireplace nearby. Richard gave a small, impatient nod. "Let us get started," he said. "Some of us have businesses to run." Daniel ignored the remark and continued reading. Several family members received vacation properties, trust funds, stock distributions, and investment accounts. At first, the atmosphere remained calm. But as each name was called, subtle disappointment slowly spread across the room. The numbers were smaller than expected, the assets more restricted. Charles Whitmore had clearly structured his estate carefully, and nobody seemed pleased about it. Richard's younger cousin frowned openly after learning his inheritance was tied to strict financial conditions. An aunt who expected ownership of a coastal property instead received yearly payments from a charitable trust. The smiles around the room became thinner with every page Daniel turned. Richard finally leaned forward. "What exactly was my father doing with his money these last few years?" he asked coldly. Daniel continued without looking up, honoring his final wishes. Richard exhaled sharply and reached for his bourbon. Across the room, Margaret remained perfectly still. Richard noticed her silence again and smirked faintly. "Interesting," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "She still looks hopeful." A few relatives chuckled quietly. Maybe there is a spare lamp or rocking chair hidden in the paperwork somewhere. This time the laughter faded almost immediately. Something in the atmosphere had shifted. Even those mocking Margaret earlier now seemed distracted by growing uncertainty over their own inheritance. Daniel turned another page slowly, then another. His expression became more serious with each document. Richard noticed it first. "What is it?" he asked. Daniel hesitated briefly before answering. "There are additional instructions attached to the estate." The room straightened at once. Silverware paused against crystal glasses. A hush settled beneath the chandeliers. Richard narrowed his eyes. Additional instructions for who? Daniel looked toward the final sealed envelope resting separately beside the remaining documents. Unlike the others, this one carried a dark red wax seal pressed with Charles Whitmore's initials. Daniel remembered the old billionaire placing it into his hands personally just 48 hours before his death. This envelope, Charles had whispered weakly from his hospital bed, must only be opened when everyone is present, especially her. Daniel slowly lifted his eyes toward Margaret Hale. She met his gaze calmly from across the room. No fear, no surprise, just quiet understanding. And in that moment, Daniel realized the woman they had mocked all evening was not waiting to hear the outcome of the will. She already knew Charles Whitmore better than anyone else in that mansion ever had. The sealed envelope remained untouched on the mahogany table while tension spread through the Whitmore estate like smoke filling a locked room. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Rain pressed harder against the towering windows, and somewhere deeper in the mansion an old pipe groaned softly beneath the walls. Daniel Mercer rested one hand on the final document, but did not open it yet. He understood something the family did not. Charles Whitmore had designed this moment carefully. Every pause mattered. Every silence carried intention. Richard Whitmore leaned forward impatiently, the confidence in his expression beginning to crack around the edges. "If there is another section," he said sharply, "then read it." Daniel looked toward him calmly. "There are additional directives attached to the remaining estate assets." Richard frowned. "Remaining assets?" One of the cousins shifted nervously in her chair. "You mean there is more?" Daniel nodded once. A substantial amount more. The room immediately changed. People who had looked disappointed moments earlier suddenly straightened in their seats again. Eyes sharpened. Calculations returned. Richard slowly leaned back, recovering his composure. Of course there was more. His father had always hidden the largest numbers until the end. That was how Charles Whitmore controlled people. Richard glanced briefly toward Margaret and smirked again, reassured by his own assumptions. "Well," he said loudly, "at least we know she did not come for nothing. This should be educational." A few uneasy laughs followed, though nobody seemed fully comfortable anymore. Margaret remained still beneath the soft wall light, her hands folded gently over her gloves. She did not defend herself. She did not lower her eyes. The strange thing was that the longer she remained silent, the smaller everyone else began to look around her. Daniel carefully adjusted the documents before speaking again. "Before I continue," he said, "Charles Whitmore requested that one specific statement be read aloud exactly as written." Richard exhaled impatiently. "My father loved dramatic speeches. Please get on with it." Daniel unfolded a handwritten page separate from the typed documents. Unlike the formal legal paperwork, this page carried visible ink marks and slight tremors in the handwriting. Charles had written it himself during his final days. Daniel began reading slowly. "To my family, if you are hearing this now, then you are likely sitting together in the main hall arguing over ownership before my body has even finished resting." Several faces around the table tightened immediately. Richard looked irritated. Daniel continued, "Most of you spent your lives asking what my wealth could do for you. Only one person ever asked what was destroying me." Silence swallowed the room. Margaret's expression did not change. Richard crossed his arms. "What exactly is this supposed to mean?" Daniel ignored the interruption and kept reading. "Money reveals character faster than hardship ever will. By tonight, you will understand that lesson completely." The final sentence seemed to linger beneath the chandeliers long after Daniel stopped speaking. Nobody moved. Even the fire beside the marble hearth had burned lower, casting softer shadows across the room. Richard gave a dismissive laugh, though it sounded forced now. He always enjoyed sounding mysterious. But Daniel noticed something important. Richard had stopped looking at the other relatives. His eyes kept drifting back toward Margaret Hale. Somewhere deep inside, instinct had finally begun whispering that something was wrong. One of the younger relatives leaned toward Richard nervously. "Do you think he changed the company's shares?" Richard answered immediately. "Impossible. Father knew who built this family." But the certainty in his voice no longer matched the expression on his face. Daniel slowly placed the handwritten letter aside and reached toward the final sealed envelope with deliberate care. The dark red wax seal reflected beneath the chandelier light like drying blood against ivory paper. Every eye in the room followed his hands. Richard swallowed once before speaking again. "Who is that envelope addressed to?" Daniel looked down briefly, then back up. His voice remained calm. "It is addressed to the future owner of the Whitmore estate." A hush fell across the mansion, so complete that the ticking grandfather clock suddenly sounded deafening. And through all of it, Margaret Hale sat quietly in the corner, looking less like a guest and more like someone waiting for the world to finally catch up to the truth. Daniel Mercer held the sealed envelope carefully between both hands while the Whitmore family watched him with growing tension. The wax seal reflected beneath the chandelier light as thunder rolled softly outside the estate. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a drink anymore. The greed that had filled the room earlier was slowly being replaced by something far more dangerous. Fear. Richard Whitmore tried to maintain his composure, but his jaw tightened visibly as Daniel slid a letter opener beneath the seal. "This is unnecessary drama," Richard muttered. "My father always confused secrecy with wisdom." Daniel did not respond. He unfolded the thick document inside the envelope with slow precision, scanning the first page silently before lifting his eyes toward the room. Something changed in his expression immediately. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Even he had not expected this. Richard noticed it at once. "What is it?" he demanded. Daniel hesitated for the first time all evening. The silence stretched long enough to make several relatives exchange nervous glances. Margaret Hale remained completely still beneath the dim wall light, her face calm and unreadable while rain streaked down the windows behind her like silver threads. Daniel cleared his throat quietly. The final directive of Charles Whitmore concerns the controlling ownership of Whitmore Holdings Incorporated, the family estate, all international investment accounts, the trust reserve, and every remaining undeclared asset under the Whitmore portfolio. The room leaned forward almost as one body. Richard slowly smiled again, reassured by the mention of controlling ownership. Finally, he said under his breath. Daniel looked back down at the document. His voice became slower now, more careful. As stated here, all remaining assets are to pass entirely and permanently to, he stopped. The pause hit the room like a power outage. Richard frowned immediately. To who? Daniel lifted his eyes toward Margaret Hale. The room followed his gaze seconds later. Confusion spread across several faces instantly. Richard gave a short laugh. Wait, he said, shaking his head slightly. No, Daniel spoke clearly. To Margaret Hale, sole beneficiary and permanent controlling heir to the Whitmore estate. The mansion fell completely silent. Somewhere outside, thunder rolled across the hills again, but inside the estate nobody even breathed. Richard stared at Daniel as though he had spoken another language. One woman near the fireplace dropped her champagne glass onto the carpet, barely noticing. Margaret did not move. Daniel continued carefully, though his own voice carried disbelief now. This includes full ownership of Whitmore Holdings, the Greenwich estate, the Aspen property, all voting shares, all executive authority, and the primary family trust currently valued at approximately $480 million. Richard stood up, so abruptly his chair scraped violently across the marble floor. That is impossible. His face had turned pale beneath the chandelier light. There has to be some mistake. Daniel kept his eyes on the document. There is no mistake. Richard stepped closer to the table. My father would never leave this company to her. Margaret finally lifted her gaze toward him calmly. Richard pointed at her openly now, his voice rising despite himself. She was nobody. The words echoed through the hall before dying into silence. Margaret's expression never changed. Daniel slowly removed another sheet attached behind the inheritance directive. There is an additional statement from Charles Whitmore, he said quietly. Richard looked ready to explode with disbelief, but Daniel began reading before anyone could interrupt. To my family, if this outcome shocks you, then you never understood who truly stood beside me while the rest of you stood beside my money. Nobody spoke. Richard froze completely. Daniel continued. Margaret Hale protected this company long before any of you cared enough to learn how it survived. Everything you inherited from me exists because she asked for nothing in return. The words landed harder than the inheritance itself. A hush settled over the mansion so deep that even the fire beside the hearth seemed to burn more quietly. Richard looked at Margaret again, but this time there was no mockery left in his eyes. Only confusion, humiliation, and the first terrifying realization that the quiet woman he had laughed at all night was now the most powerful person in the room. Richard Whitmore remained standing beside the mahogany table as though his body had forgotten how to sit. The color had drained from his face completely now, leaving only anger and disbelief fighting for control behind his eyes. Around him, the Whitmore family stared at Margaret Hale with expressions that had transformed from mockery into stunned confusion. Only an hour earlier they had treated her like an embarrassment standing in the wrong room. Now every crystal chandelier above them reflected off the face of the woman who owned everything beneath it. Rain hammered harder against the estate windows while the fireplace crackled softly through the silence. Daniel Mercer carefully organized the inheritance documents, though even he seemed shaken by what he had just read aloud. This cannot stand, Richard finally said, his voice low and strained. My father was sick. He was manipulated. Margaret looked at him calmly from across the room. Your father was very clear-minded before he died. Richard turned sharply toward her. You expect us to believe he gave nearly $500 million to a woman nobody has heard from in years? Margaret answered without emotion. No, I expect you to believe the truth. The words landed heavily in the silent mansion. One of the younger relatives slowly lowered her wine glass onto the table with trembling hands. Another stared at Margaret as though trying to remember every rude thing she had said earlier that evening. Richard gave a bitter laugh and began pacing across the marble floor. This is unbelievable, he muttered. A woman who walked in here wearing a 10-year-old coat now controls Whitmore Holdings? Daniel finally spoke again. Legally speaking, yes. Richard stopped walking. There has to be a challenge clause. There is not. Then we can test his mental condition. Daniel shook his head immediately. Charles Whitmore underwent 3 separate evaluations before signing the final documents. Every directive was witnessed, recorded, and certified. Richard froze mid-step. The room seemed smaller now, tighter somehow, as though the walls themselves were closing around the family's collapsing expectations. Margaret quietly reached for the glass of water beside her chair, but still had not touched a single expensive drink offered all evening. Her composure only made the humiliation worse. Richard suddenly looked toward the other relatives, as if searching for support. "Say something," he demanded. "This woman does not belong here." But nobody answered him. Not because they supported Margaret, but because fear had already begun rewriting their loyalties. The same people who laughed at her coat now avoided meeting her eyes. One older aunt finally cleared her throat nervously. "Margaret," she said softly, forcing an awkward smile. "Perhaps we all got off on the wrong foot tonight." Richard stared at her in disbelief. The woman continued carefully. "Charles clearly trusted you deeply." Margaret looked at her for a long moment before responding. "Interesting," she said quietly. "You did not seem curious about his trust an hour ago." The older woman immediately lowered her eyes. A hush fell again. Richard clenched his jaw so tightly the muscles beneath his temples twitched visibly. "What exactly did you do?" he asked Margaret coldly. "What did my father owe you?" Margaret slowly stood from her chair for the first time that evening. The room instinctively straightened as she rose. Her gray coat hung simply against her shoulders. Yet somehow she now carried more authority than anyone beneath the chandeliers. "Your father owed me nothing," she replied calmly. "That is why he trusted me." Richard opened his mouth to answer, but no words came. For the first time in his life, power had shifted in front of him without asking permission. Daniel Mercer watched quietly from beside the fireplace, remembering something else Charles Whitmore had once told him years ago over a late dinner in Manhattan. "The dangerous people in this world are never the loud ones," Charles had said. "The truly powerful ones are the people who stay calm while everyone else loses control." Standing there in the center of the Whitmore estate while the family struggled to process its own downfall, Margaret Hale looked exactly like the woman Charles Whitmore had been describing all along. The storm outside the Whitmore estate had begun to fade, but inside the mansion the tension only deepened. Nobody cared about the rain anymore. Nobody cared about the inheritance numbers either. The only thing haunting the room now was a single question none of them could answer. Who was Margaret Hale really? Richard Whitmore stood near the fireplace with one hand gripping the edge of the marble mantel so tightly his knuckles had turned pale beneath the golden light. He kept staring at Margaret as though he could force the truth out of her through anger alone. "You are hiding something," he finally said. Margaret looked at him quietly. "No," she answered. "Your family simply never cared enough to ask." The words settled heavily across the room. Daniel Mercer slowly removed another folded page from the inheritance documents. "There is one final personal statement from Charles Whitmore regarding Margaret Hale," he said carefully. Richard closed his eyes briefly with visible frustration. "Of course there is." Daniel unfolded the page and began reading aloud. 22 years ago, Whitmore Holdings was 3 weeks away from collapse. Several relatives looked up immediately. Even Richard frowned. That part of the company history had never been discussed publicly. Daniel continued. "Our debt exposure exceeded $200 million. Investors were leaving. Banks were preparing to dismantle everything I built." The room remained completely still now. "I spent those months drinking too much, sleeping too little, and trusting the wrong people, including members of my own family." Richard shifted uncomfortably. Daniel kept reading. "Then Margaret Hale walked into my office carrying nothing except a yellow legal pad and more honesty than anyone around me could tolerate." A faint memory flickered across Margaret's face for the first time all evening. Not pride, not bitterness, only sadness. Daniel continued reading Charles's words. "She was not a banker. She was not a board member. She was not born into wealth. But within 48 hours, she understood my company better than executives I had paid millions of dollars to advise me." One of the younger relatives whispered softly, "What?" Daniel looked down at the next lines. "Margaret discovered financial leaks inside the company that my own board failed to notice. She reorganized our debt structure, identified internal corruption, and negotiated terms that saved Whitmore Holdings from bankruptcy. Silence swallowed the room entirely. Richard stared at Margaret in disbelief. "That is impossible," he said weakly. Margaret finally looked toward him directly. "Your father almost lost everything because nobody around him was willing to tell him the truth." Richard shook his head slowly. Why would he never mention any of this? Daniel answered before Margaret could. Because she asked him not to. Several faces turned toward Margaret immediately. Daniel continued reading. Margaret refused compensation beyond her consulting fee. She refused public credit. She refused executive status. When I offered her stock ownership, she declined and told me to repair my relationship with my family instead. Richard looked stunned now. He offered you ownership? Margaret nodded faintly. A long time ago. The mansion felt different suddenly. Smaller. Colder. The family members who once viewed her as insignificant now struggled to even meet her eyes. Daniel lowered the final page carefully. Charles Whitmore added one last sentence beneath his signature. He paused briefly before reading it aloud. The world respects loud people because it mistakes noise for strength. But the strongest person I ever met was the quiet woman everyone else ignored. Richard slowly sank back into his chair as though the weight of the room had finally broken through his pride. He looked around the estate his family had worshipped for decades, then back toward Margaret Hale, standing calmly beneath the chandelier light. For the first time that night, he understood the cruelest part of all. The woman they mocked had never needed the Whitmore fortune. The Whitmore fortune existed because of her. The atmosphere inside the Whitmore estate had changed completely. Earlier that evening, the mansion felt like a palace filled with confidence and entitlement. Now it felt like a courtroom after a guilty verdict. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody whispered jokes about Margaret Hale's coat or shoes. The same relatives who once avoided sitting near her now watched her every movement with anxious attention, as though one sentence from her could determine the future of their lives. Richard Whitmore stood near the fireplace, staring into the fading flames, his reflection trembling faintly in the polished marble above the mantel. He had spent decades believing the Whitmore empire belonged to him by birthright. Now he realized his father had trusted someone else more than his own blood. The humiliation was almost unbearable. One of the younger cousins finally broke the silence. "Margaret," she said softly, "I think we all misunderstood things tonight." Margaret looked toward her calmly, but did not answer. The young woman forced a nervous smile. "Charles clearly valued you. Deeply." Another relative quickly joined in. "You have to understand, nobody ever told us about your role in the company." Margaret's expression remained unreadable. "No," she replied quietly. "Nobody ever asked." The room fell silent again. Richard slowly turned away from the fireplace and walked toward her. His arrogance was still there, but weakened now beneath desperation. "If what my father wrote is true," he said carefully, "then perhaps mistakes were made tonight." Margaret met his eyes steadily. "Mistakes reveal character." Richard swallowed once. Even Daniel Mercer noticed how different his voice sounded now. Softer, controlled, careful, like a man suddenly aware that power no longer belonged to him. "Look," Richard continued, lowering his tone further. Emotions were high. "My father just died. People said things they did not mean." Margaret glanced around the mansion slowly. Crystal chandeliers hung above people who could no longer hide behind wealth or status. "You meant every word," she said calmly. Nobody defended Richard this time. One older aunt stepped closer nervously. "Margaret, surely we can find a way to move forward together as family." The word family seemed to linger awkwardly in the air. Margaret looked toward her with quiet disbelief. "Interesting," she said softly. "I was not family when I walked through that door." The woman immediately lowered her eyes. Richard took another step forward. "You have to understand what this company means to us." Margaret answered almost instantly. "No, I understand what the money means to you." Richard froze. She was right, and everyone in the room knew it. Daniel Mercer quietly gathered the documents while observing the scene unfold with almost painful clarity. Charles Whitmore had predicted every part of this night. The greed, the cruelty, the sudden politeness once power changed hands. Margaret slowly walked toward the long windows overlooking the rain-soaked estate grounds. Her reflection appeared faintly against the dark glass while thunder rolled softly in the distance. "Do you know what Charles feared most near the end?" she asked without turning around. Nobody answered. he was not afraid of losing money, she continued. He was afraid his family would forget how to treat people without it. The words cut deeper than any insult could have. Richard looked down at the marble floor beneath his polished shoes, unable to respond. Margaret finally turned back toward the room. Your father spent years trying to teach humility to people who only admired power. Her eyes moved slowly across every face in the mansion. Tonight proved he was right to worry. Silence spread once more beneath the chandeliers. Not angry silence. Not shocked silence. Something heavier. Shame. The kind that arrives too late to undo what has already been revealed. Richard opened his mouth as if searching for one final argument, but Margaret gently interrupted him before he could speak. You only learned kindness after losing control, she said quietly. That is not kindness at all. The room went completely still. And for the first time in the history of the Whitmore estate, nobody had enough power left to speak back to the quiet woman standing in the center of it. The rain had finally slowed to a soft drizzle by the time Margaret Hale walked toward the front entrance of the Whitmore estate. The mansion behind her no longer felt powerful. The crystal chandeliers still glowed above the marble floors. The paintings still hung in golden frames, and the expensive silence of old money still filled every corner of the hall. But something essential had collapsed inside those walls tonight. Pride, illusion, entitlement. Daniel Mercer quietly gathered the final inheritance papers into his leather briefcase, while members of the Whitmore family remained frozen around the room, unable to fully process how quickly power had abandoned them. Richard Whitmore stood motionless near the fireplace, staring at the floor beneath him. The confidence that once controlled every room he entered had vanished completely. He looked smaller somehow, like a man finally seeing himself clearly for the first time. Margaret paused near the doorway and slipped her gloves back onto her hands with calm precision. One of the younger relatives suddenly stepped forward nervously. Margaret, she said softly, what happens now? Several eyes immediately turned toward her. The question hanging beneath those words was obvious. Would she punish them? Would she remove them from the company? Would she take revenge for the humiliation they had caused her only hours earlier? Margaret looked across the room slowly before answering. Tomorrow morning, she said calmly, Whitmore Holdings will continue operating exactly as it did yesterday. A few relatives visibly relaxed. But Margaret continued. The employees who worked honestly will keep their jobs. The people who earned respect will keep it. Her eyes briefly rested on Richard. The rest will have to learn the difference between authority and character. Nobody spoke. Richard finally lifted his head. You are really going to keep the company? He asked quietly. Margaret gave the faintest nod. Your father spent his life building something meaningful. I will not destroy it to satisfy wounded pride. The words carried no cruelty at all, which somehow made them hurt more. Richard looked away again, ashamed. Daniel stepped closer to Margaret near the entrance. Charles believed you would protect the company better than anyone else, he said softly. Margaret's expression softened for the first time all evening. She glanced back toward the portrait above the fireplace where Charles Whitmore still overlooked the room in silence. He spent years trying to save his family from themselves, she replied quietly. I do not think he ever stopped hoping they would change. A hush settled across the mansion once more. Not the silence of tension this time, but the silence left behind when truth finally empties a room of excuses. Margaret reached for the front door and paused one final moment before leaving. Without turning around, she spoke calmly into the stillness behind her. Wealth is not what reveals a person, she said. Power is. Nobody moved. Nobody argued. Because every person inside the Whitmore estate knew exactly what tonight had revealed about them. Margaret stepped outside into the cold evening air as the rain mist drifted across the stone driveway. The line of black luxury cars remained waiting beneath the estate lights, but now the massive mansion behind her belonged to the quiet woman everyone had mocked only hours earlier. She walked slowly toward the front gate beneath the dim glow of the lanterns, her gray coat moving softly in the wind while thunder faded far beyond the Connecticut hills. Inside the estate, the Whitmore family remained surrounded by chandeliers, marble, and millions of dollars worth of inherited luxury, yet none of it could protect them from the humiliation settling into the room like dust. Richard Whitmore stood alone beside the dying fire, replaying every cruel word he had spoken to the woman who now owned everything he once believed was guaranteed to him. And somewhere beyond the rain-covered windows of the estate, Charles Whitmore's final lesson lingered quietly in the silence he left behind. Dignity does not announce itself loudly. It waits patiently while arrogance destroys itself.